Greetings, Old Testament class. This is your lecture over Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther in preparation for our exam on Friday. So just a little bit of review. Sometimes when we're working through some of these historical books, it's easy to get lost in where we are in the story. So this story takes place during what is called the Sea of the Babylonian, or Sea of Exile. So you got A for Assyria, B for the Babylonians, C is Cyrus the Persian, right? This is when the Persian Empire has kicked out the Babylonians, and now Cyrus the Persian has taken over. So this is kind of to the tail end, actually, of the Old Testament. Really, historically, especially as we talk about the book of Esther, we're really coming to the end of the recorded period of the Old Testament before it would begin the New Testament. So let's look at this. Here's a little bit of background. The Babylonians, when they occupied Jerusalem, remember they occupy Jerusalem, they kill a bunch of people, they take a bunch of people back to Babylon, like spread them out, and they destroy Jerusalem, tore down the first temple. When that had been completely destroyed, after that, the Persians come into power and they run the Babylonians out. So the temple then is rebuilt. This is what we call the Second Temple, and it's rebuilt under the direction of the Persian Empire and specifically Cyrus the Great. At the temple then, worship has been restored. The practices that were outlined for what should take place at the temple have been happening again. But there seems to be kind of a lack of connectivity between God and the worship of God by God's people. They seem to be missing the point. We can remember that the point of the temple is not the temple itself. The point of offering sacrifices to God is to not get God somehow off your back for another week. The point of worship at the temple is relationship with God. And so part of what Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are speaking to is just the spiritual apathy that had arisen out of God's people as they kind of been integrating themselves into the Persian culture and losing their distinctiveness as God's chosen people. One particular problem that we'll bump into here is that God's people not only married into the Assyrian, Babylonian families, but also into the Persian families as well, and that's a significant part of the equation as well. Okay, so first two books we're going to talk about are Ezra and Nehemiah. Again, this is set during the context of the Persian occupation. The Bible actually initially held these two books as the same book, right? They were not initially two distinct books. Separating these two books can sometimes confuse the reality of how they are actually very interrelated. Theme, structure, and their literary technique all have items of overlap that connect these two works. Both Ezra and Nehemiah served in the Persian Empire. And so you can imagine, again, remember when the Babylonians come and take over, they take the best of the best with them back to their nation and also put some of those folks to work. Ezra and Nehemiah, now having survived the Persian Empire, kicking the Babylonian Empire out, are again given roles within the context of the Persian Empire. Ezra held a position in the Persian royal court as an advisor of Jewish affairs. Our textbook says that Jewish tradition holds that Ezra is almost thought of as just to be about as great as Moses. And if you've been paying attention in class at all, you know that, especially in my mind, is very high praise. So Ezra is thought to be an advisor about Jewish affairs, and then Nehemiah was a cupbearer to the king. So here's what those literary patterns look like and how there's quite a bit of overlap between Ezra and Nehemiah. So starting with the book of Ezra, first it starts off with a kingly decree in Ezra chapter 1, and it describes Cyrus the Persian allowing the Jews And again, that term Jews is a term that comes into use more regularly after the exile. So, allowing the Jews to rebuild the temple of God. And the implication is that Cyrus has encountered the God of Israel and has been moved to rebuild the temple. So, those who had been liberated from exile, again by Cyrus the Persian, are now on their way back to Jerusalem. And you can hear an echo of God's people here, right? As they're moving in mass. Now, where are they heading? Back to the promised land. It's an echo of the book of Exodus, having been liberated. The next element is the people move back to Jerusalem, and the prince of Judah, a guy named Zerubbabel, leads the charge, right? He's leading the charge at this time. God's people are marked as giving offerings to help with the rebuild of the temple, and many of the things that have been looted out of the temple by the Babylonians are now being given back to the Israelites. They rebuilt the altar, and they also began laying the foundation of the temple. The next element that is common to both stories is that opposition to the rebuild, in this case of the temple, starts as their surrounding neighbors, and we're talking foreign nations here, not fellow Israelites, they bring up objections. The people who were against the rebuilding of the temple, they initially offer help to rebuild the temple, but then they start to discourage the builders, and they send letters to the king of Persia. And by now, the king is no longer Cyrus. Actually, the king is now Artaxerxes. King Artaxerxes is overseeing the Persian Empire. So the letters that they sent back to King Artaxerxes claimed that if the people rebuild the temple, they're only going to rebel against you. They're never going to pay taxes again, and they're going to start their own kingdom. This brings everything to a stop. And God's people, who had returned with Jerusalem in tremendous joy, having been liberated from exile, are now being thwarted. God then sends the prophets Haggai and Zechariah to inspire the Jews, the Jewish people living in Jerusalem, to take up the task of rebuilding the temple, or complete that task. King Darius, the current ruler in Persia, issues a decree allowing this indeed to happen. And it comes to completion in 515 BC, and there is a dedication of the temple and a Passover celebration that happens. A couple things to note about this second temple. It took about 23 years to rebuild. It wasn't to the scale of the first one, right? The first one was absolutely magnificent. It wasn't actually to that scale, but despite not containing all the grandeur of Solomon's temple, it was still a place of worship. And most importantly, it represented the tangible presence of God amongst God's people. So there's about a 50-year gap. As you're reading the book of Ezra, there's a 50-year gap between the end of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. King Artaxerxes at first tells Ezra to return home to teach the law of God, like that your own people don't know your God. And the idea here is that there's this ongoing inherent danger. Ezra called for God's people to dissolve their marriages if they had married outside of God's people, right? If they had married people from the Persian Empire or the Babylonian Empire, he called for them to dissolve their marriages. And specifically, the inherent danger was the incorporation of pagan beliefs into Israel's community. I mean, which of Israel's kings is a cautionary tale about marrying people outside of the worshipers of Israel's God? Yeah, King Solomon, remember all of those wives that took him off track, right? The absorption of other religions was modeled for these Israelites in a variety of ways, but not least of which, another good example would have been King Ahab, who took Jezebel as his wife as well. And boy, the prophets of Baal, all that happened with Elijah there was a total mess. So you can see the danger of intermarriage was with those who were kind of just not completely committed to the God of Israel. It was like, no, we're not against the God of Israel. We just, if we incorporate the worship of some other gods too, that wasn't a big deal to them. And it was an immediate way to start mixing their loyalties, and it was certainly breaking that very first commandment. Sometimes when we hear that they were to dissolve their marriages, we think, oh, this is a racial thing, but it's not. It's fundamentally about their identity as God's people and being in relationship with God. Okay, so how does that parallel the book of Nehemiah? Nehemiah takes place about 10 years after Ezra, and it starts this way. It starts with oddly enough, kingly decree, right? King Artaxerxes issues that decree. Nehemiah is working within the royal courts. Remember, he's a cupbearer, and he sees how the people who had been left in Jerusalem are suffering. In chapter 1, we see him praying to God that the King Artaxerxes, would allow him, Nehemiah, to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And the next day, when he is in front of the king asks him, what's wrong? And so Nehemiah tells him, and he grants his request to go back and build the walls. Nehemiah does then indeed return to Jerusalem with the king's guard, but not completely knowing how he's going to accomplish this huge goal of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. Those who were in Jerusalem, the leaders, the priests, etc., are honestly kind of skeptical of the plan. But Nehemiah rallies the support of the people. And, part of what we discover in the book of Nehemiah is that if you're waiting for a consensus or a majority vote to do God's call on your life, God's will for your life, you might be waiting a long time. You're not going to be able to have everybody's affirmation in that process. This moves us to the next parallel, opposition to the rebuilding, in this case, Nehemiah, of the walls. Remember, in Ezra's case, to the rebuild of the temple. Again, that fires up with some of their neighbors. So it starts with their surrounding neighbors. This time, however, it was more localized to them. And they didn't have people writing the letters to the king to say, hey, don't let him do this. But instead, this time, they had people kind of committing almost like guerrilla warfare against him. This led to the people who were rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem that they had to dedicate half the men would work on the actual rebuild, but then the other half the men who had volunteered for the rebuild had to stand guard with swords and shields to protect those who were doing the rebuild. There is an outcry of frustration amongst those who were rebuilding the walls and those who were actually guarding those who were rebuilding the walls because of the economic strain, right? The financial strain of giving all their time to this rebuild. As the people are working to rebuild the walls, some workers had to borrow money even to keep from falling into poverty. The prophet Nehemiah calls on those who had been borrowing money to others, right, likely their own people, to give that money back to them, right? Give those who had, as a result of falling behind on their payments, been sold into a debtor slavery, you need to let them go. Now, the question Nehemiah asks is, do you not fear God? I mean, what is wrong with you? This kind of becomes a tipping point, and there is a reform that breaks out, and the people of God get back on track. And it's during this time that Nehemiah is then named the governor over Judah. He's the governor because he's not the king. The king is King Artaxerxes, who is back in Persia, but you get the idea. So finally, the walls are completed in 44 BC. So you can kind of see the parallel back and forth there, right? Very, very similar as to what those action points are. So Nehemiah's work to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem is a theological history. It's the history of how God was at work amongst God's people and through God's people, and how God enabled Nehemiah to win the favor of the Persian king. How he enabled Nehemiah to overcome the suspicion of other nations who feared that the Jews would become too strong again. And how he allowed Nehemiah to complete the rebuild because of God's work in the world. The final section of Nehemiah focuses on the reading of the law of Moses, or the Torah. Ezra, oddly enough, is the one who reads the law to the people. This leads to the people recognizing, like becoming aware of, right? Maybe waking up to the fact of how far off base they were in their living in contrast to God's dreams for their lives. So it serves as a bit of a wake-up call as they read the law again. And this isn't just a spiritual renewal, but it also starts a social renewal. In Nehemiah chapter 8, having heard the law, the people throw a feast, and it notes that they invited the poor to eat with them at their table. So, like, yeah, do you know the community benediction? Great, but do you actually love your neighbor, right? Are you loving them sacrificially? Restoration of the law was a means of renewing their commitment, not only to God, but to each other as well. The dreams that God has for this special relationship with his people have not ended, right? That it seems like, oh, maybe this is all coming to an end, and this is one moment of renewal, and God saying, no, it's not over. All the dreams that God has are based on the faithfulness of God to love and forgive his people. At the tail end of the book of Nehemiah, we have this text. But our ancestors acted ignorantly. They were stubborn and wouldn't obey your commandments. They refused to obey and didn't remember the wondrous signs that you accomplished in their midst. They acted arrogantly and decided to return to their slavery in Egypt. But you are a God ready to forgive, merciful and compassionate, very patient, and truly faithful. You didn't forsake them. You hear that echo again, right? Pulling back on that Exodus story. If God was indeed ready to forgive, merciful and compassionate, very patient and truly faithful, and he didn't forsake them, he won't forsake his people now as well. Okay, the final book then that we're going to cover in this lecture is the book of Esther, and this can be a very popular book, might be one that you bumped into before, at least the story of Esther. Esther takes place likely between the time of 486 to 464, and it's under the reign of Xerxes. Unlike Ezra or Nehemiah, the action doesn't take place in Jerusalem, but in this case, it takes place in Susa, one of the main governing areas of the Persian Empire. The story begins with King Xerxes hosting a banquet, and he invites one of his wives, one of his queens, to appear at the party. Queen Vashti doesn't want to attend the banquet because he wants her to stand in front of everyone wearing only her crown, right? So she refuses, and a search for a new queen is undertaken. This is where we bump into Esther. Esther is a poor Jewish girl. She has been being raised by her cousin Mordecai, who has risen in the royal court under King Xerxes. And Esther ends up being welcomed as a new queen in Xerxes' palace. though, I mean, truth be told, she was likely one girl in a harem of more than 1,000 other girls, right? So a hunt for a new queen is issued after Queen Vashti won't obey, and it's Esther who is selected, this poor Jewish girl. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, has raised her likely because she was an orphan. So here's where the plot thickens or conflict arises in the story. Mordecai, who again is working his way up the chain of command in the palace, discovers a plot to assassinate King Xerxes. This plot has been initiated by a guy named Haman, Haman, and another one of the king's officials. Mordecai is trying to work to stop this from happening, but it's not as simple as just going to tell the king what's happening. So Haman, in this case, is like the prime minister, right? Like the second in command. Everyone in the kingdom would bow to Haman when he entered the room, but Mordecai refused to bow, and thus Haman wanted to have him killed. So Mordecai won't bow the knee to Haman, and Haman wants to have him killed. And not only just does he want to have Mordecai killed, he wants all of Mordecai's people killed, or all of the Jews. Haman deceives King Xerxes into being a part of a plot to kill the Jews by getting him to issue this royal decree. A date is set and a royal decree is issued allowing all the Jewish people to be attacked by their neighbors. And the intention is to exterminate, to wipe out the Jewish people. Mordecai then, right, remember that's Esther's uncle, or cousin, pardon me. Mordecai, Esther's cousin, talks to Esther and says to her, look, you have got to do something about this royal decree that has been issued. Only you have this opportunity that is in front of you, right? Not that it's not up to God, but maybe God might want to use you to change the king's mind. And we get this very famous text in Esther chapter 4. Mordecai sends this letter to Esther, a reply to Esther's letters, and says, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all the other Jews are killed. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your relatives will die. Who knows if perhaps you were made queen for just such a time as this? All right, just such a time as this. Like this might be the very reason God put you in that very unlikely place of being in the palace of King Artaxerxes. So, how does the story end? Esther establishes a banquet, and she invites Haman and King Xerxes to this banquet. And Esther asks the king to spare her life and the life of her people because of Haman's decree that all Jews would be killed on a specific day. One scholar gives us a little bit of insight here that helps us kind of get a little better idea of what's kind of happening in the background of the story. This scholar writes it this way: because we are so well acquainted with this story, we just assume Esther is exaggerating, right? And by exaggerating, we mean like the amount of danger that she's in even issuing this banquet and inviting the king to it and speaking to the king. It says this: after all, the king does accept her, but Esther really didn't know that. This was the king who got rid of the first queen on a whim. This was the king who commanded the engineers of a bridge he was building to be thrown off the end of the bridge when they fell behind due to a horrible storm. When a father requested this king not to send his last son off to war, he had his 3 other sons die in this king's war. The king commanded that the last son be killed in front of the father, and then the father blinded, so that was the last thing he saw. This was the king to which Esther was going without an invitation. So Esther pleads for the lives of her people, and the king agrees. Right? Esther could have been killed even for speaking to the king without first being spoken to, but the king agrees after she pleads for the lives of her people. Haman, oddly enough, his plan is revealed, and the very fate, death by hanging, that he was trying to have in store for Mordecai is the very way he dies in the end. The decree to have the Jews killed had already gone out, though. And the Persian law stated that once that decree is sent out, it can't be changed, even by the king himself. But Esther and Mordecai get the king to issue another royal proclamation that allowed the Jews to defend themselves against anyone who would attack them. So there's the overview of Esther. And again, the idea that sometimes we think that following God's not going to require any risk at all, right? It's not going to require us to stick our necks out. That once we start following God, everything should just get really easy. But that does not appear to be the story. And Mordecai reminds Esther that maybe for a time such as this, you've been placed exactly where you are. But regardless, even if you don't risk your neck for God and God's people, God will still deliver the Jews. Although he says, probably you and your family, which would include Mordecai, will probably die. An unbelievable story. Oddly enough, read through the book of Esther and look to see that the name of God is not even mentioned once in that book. Well, gang, that's the final lecture. Hopefully you'll be able to listen to that prior to the exam. I'll see you guys soon.